Like nature, great art is distinguished by its formal immediacy. A PhD may be required to figure out what's so wonderful about Pablo Picasso, but anyone can see the greatness of Michelangelo's Sistine ceiling. It is the excellence of great art which motivates one to take the trouble to understand it, just as the beauty of nature provoked the discovery of philosophy in a moment of wonder at the mystery of being. If a painting should fail to move and delight, it will also fail to instruct, because a halo of verbiage will not compensate for what a painting lacks in excellence. Assuming that I have not failed entirely, I offer an interpretation of my paintings. At the core of the exhibition is a collection of history paintings, including 9 of religious subjects and 5 of mythological subjects. Each of the mythological paintings focuses on a female protagonist, modeled after Titian's seminal mythological series, painted during the 1550s and 60s, known as the Poesie, which by sheer coincidence were brought together for the first time in several hundred years in a groundbreaking exhibition at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum last year in 2021. For those fortunate to have seen that exhibit, it will provide the perfect contextualization for my own. Context is always key, because a painting does not interpret itself. A painting has to be read, and like any text, it is liable to be misunderstood by those too far removed from the author's point of view. I was disappointed, if not entirely surprised, to find that Titian's paintings at the Gardner met with widespread incomprehension for this very reason. The critical response included a lot of hand-wringing and moralizing over Titian's subject matter, and even the subtitle of the show, Women, Myth, and Power, implied a postmodern analysis of the paintings, which were dutifully filtered by the commentariat through the meta-narrative of intersectionality. It is needless to say that Titian had no such narrative frame in mind. Of course, it is not obligatory when interpreting a work of art to defer to the author's intention. A text can always be interpreted in many different ways, and if it can be improved upon by recontextualizing it, the best interpretation may not be what the author intended at all. As a matter of fact, this is exactly what Renaissance artists did with ancient mythology. The depiction of Greco-Roman myths by Titian and other artists of his generation would have been unthinkable, absent a creative misreading of them, because Renaissance artists were not ancient pagans. In antiquity, myths were the propaganda of a pagan religion. But in the Italian Renaissance, they were aestheticized and allegorized, the better to suit the purposes and sensibilities of the time. Renaissance paintings naturally represent a medieval view of reality, because they were painted by medieval people. Wandering around Florence and spending most of my spare time in the museums and churches, it was obvious to me, despite having no deep familiarity with Catholicism at the time, that Renaissance art was a tradition of Catholic art. The first generation of Renaissance art was invented to adorn the walls of Franciscan and Dominican churches, as I discovered firsthand, touring Santa Croce and Santa Maria Novella in Florence, and even as I delved into the works of Petrarch, the founder of Renaissance humanism, and read Giorgio Vasari's Lives of the Artists, I could not discover a trace of the 19th century's secular humanism, which historians since Jakob Burckhardt have projected onto the Italian Renaissance. It was not long before I came to the conclusion that unorthodox currents of Renaissance thought, which were promoted by Marsilio Ficino and Pico della Mirandola, exerted only a negligible influence over artists in comparison to Dominican and Franciscan theology, which consisted of a grand philosophical synthesis of the best that had been thought and said by both pagan and Christian authors, and had been achieved already by the late 13th century, at the very moment that Giotto began to revive classical mimesis. The Renaissance was a Catholic appropriation of classical culture, which began when St. Thomas Aquinas figuratively baptized Aristotle. It is not incidental that Giorgio Vasari described the revival of classical art as a rebirth, using the imagery of the sacrament of baptism, and he was not the first to do so. The self-explanatory intention of the very first Renaissance painting of the female nude, Botticelli's Birth of Venus, was to baptize classical art by depicting a classical nude being born from the water. The appropriation of the classical nude and of pagan mythology entailed an invisible metamorphosis. As a metaphorical baptism, the Renaissance justified and sanctified the artifacts of pagan culture by effecting a transformation of their meaning. Make no mistake, the worldview of pre-Socratic pagan religions originally expressed by naked statues and pagan myths was very much contrary to classical theism. Unlike Platonism, ancient Judaism, and later Christianity, pagan religions were polytheistic, and the gods which they worshipped were not transcendent, but forces of nature. Divinity was not believed to be from above, but from below, nor was this ground of being believed to be eternal and unchanging, as in monotheism, but a watery abyss of nothingness, a fluid foundation of pure potency from which all things come. How exactly something is supposed to come from nothing is a question which Parmenides was the first to pose. Prior to the discovery of logic and ontology by classical philosophers, the prevailing polytheistic worldview was fundamentally irrational. Whereas the foundation of Aristotle's logic is an absolute distinction between being and non-being, from which the principles of identity, the excluded middle, and non-contradiction follow, the implicit foundation of pagan logic, to say nothing of Hegel's, was the identity of being and non-being. It was assumed that the ground of existence is nothing in itself, implying that there is no supreme good, and therefore that human existence is defined by moral contradiction, there being no absolute standard of good and evil. From Agamemnon to Medea, the protagonists of Greek literature are shockingly amoral, pulled to and fro by fateful commitments in irreconcilable conflict with one another, which is why Socrates didn't think very highly of the Homeric epics, and he thought even less of the tragedies of his own day. From Cronus devouring his own children to Zeus's sexual escapades, the gods as depicted in Greek mythology are rapacious fiends, motivated only by their lust for pleasure and power. When being is defined as potency, and the gods are merely the powers of nature, the inescapable meaning of life is to wield power. Pagans revered their kings as gods, because lording power over others was their definition of godliness. Classical thinkers witnessed the deplorable implications of this ethos in practice. The central theme of Thucydides' history of the Peloponnesian War is the human misery caused by the Athenians' relativistic worldview, which motivated them to lord their power over their neighbors with impunity. It was Socrates' hope that a reformation of Athenian society could be accomplished by means of philosophical education, and it was for this purpose that Plato founded his academy, though arguably to no avail. Classical philosophy failed to change the character of pagan society, which did not shed its idolatry or build a world in conformity with natural revelation. Notwithstanding Petrarch's idealized representation of the noble pagan Scipio Africanus, or Christ's own expression of astonishment at the faith of the centurion mentioned in the Gospel, neither ancient Greece nor ancient Rome ever exemplified the ideals of its own philosophy. It was the Catholic Church which accomplished what philosophy alone could not, an achievement which is commemorated by two of Raphael's greatest masterpieces, located in the Stanza della Segnatura in the Vatican. The two paintings now known by the spurious names of the School of Athens and the Disputation are in fact a depiction of the fulfillment of philosophy by theology, the perfection of reason by faith, and the completion of natural revelation by divine revelation, in recognition of the fact that it was the Catholic Church which set up a world in which the principles of Aristotelian logic actually hold, and which was governed in the best of times by philosopher kings, saintly popes, and saintly monarchs who established justice in the temporal order and the mercy of God in the spiritual order. The healing balm which philosophical reason could not administer was Christian charity. To be, from the point of view of a medieval Catholic, was not to wield power, but to love and be loved by God. There was nothing sentimental about this belief, as medieval Catholics also believed that the wages of failing to be charitable toward God and neighbor is an eternal privation of being known as damnation. Wealthy patrons like the Medici supported great art and architecture not only for their own self-aggrandizement, but to exercise the Christian virtues of magnificence and charity, because the salvation of their souls depended upon it. The wealthy had a grave obligation to use their wealth for the common good by building great churches and monasteries and hospitals and filling them with great art. The construction of a civic environment conducive to virtue was, moreover, the highest priority of Petrarchan humanism, and upon the final return of the papacy to Rome from its so-called Babylonian captivity in Avignon, the Church itself undertook to fulfill Petrarch's dream of a new Rome, equal to the splendor of antiquity. Under Pope Sixtus IV, the city began to be rebuilt to the glory of God and for the temporal happiness of the city. Popes began collecting classical art, and in 1506, Julius II opened the very first museum of art so that the public could enjoy that papal collection. At the same time, princes of the church commissioned living artists to make paintings and sculptures of classical subject matter. There was nothing scandalous about this, as artists and their patrons had only to map Christianity and classical metaphysics onto pagan myths to transform the vulgar stories of pagan gods into beautiful Christian allegories. A host of possibilities for new meaning presented itself. Apropos of the classical artist's need to answer the charge of soullessness, the female figure in particular became an allegorical representation of the human soul, anima being feminine in Latin. It is this convention which undoubtedly guided the design of Titian's later mythological paintings. Titian's poesiae focus on the female nude, because they were presumably meant to tell an allegorical story about the life of the soul. The same tradition guided the design of my own mythological paintings. In antiquity, the nude was originally reserved for gods and heroes, because the human body in its ideal form is truly described as godlike. For the purposes of the Italian Renaissance, it made for a fitting representation of human nature in its original glory, unstained by original sin. The classical nude, with its overtones of pagan immorality, became, in the hands of Renaissance artists, a representation of prelapsarian innocence, to which state they believed the body would be restored at the general resurrection, an intention which is made quite explicit in Michelangelo's monumental painting of the Last Judgment, populated by some 300 classical nudes being raised on the last day. The gratuitous proliferation of nude bodies in Catholic art during the Renaissance did meet with a certain amount of resistance and was tempered by the judicious censorship of the Council of Trent. But once the initial anxieties of the Counter-Reformation had eased, all suspicion of Renaissance art was set aside, and the art of the Baroque was born in the service of the Counter-Reformation. The most Catholic art paradoxically became the most sensuous, such as the art of Peter Paul Rubens and Gian Lorenzo Bernini, who celebrated the beauty of the flesh without reserve in recognition of the Imago Dei stamped on it, and of the Word made flesh. Moreover, the nude was used to express not only the dignity but also the humility of man, as it is from our nakedness that we discover that we are not gods, that we, like other animals, are in fact male and female, that we come into the world with nothing, and go out of the world with nothing, that we come from an origin beyond ourselves, and go to an end we would not choose, that we have an essential nature delimited by the body and determined by the soul, which can be thwarted, but not altered. Moreover, artists used the classical nude and ancient mythology not only to speak universal truths, but also to comment on the historical moment, and my paintings have a similar intention. Titian's poesiae address the historical context of the 16th century in fascinating ways, most notably perhaps the crown jewel of the gardener's collection, The Rape of Europa, which has the distinction of being the most significant Venetian masterpiece on display in the United States. This painting of Titian's represents not only a story from Ovid's Metamorphoses, but inevitably alludes to John's Apocalypse as well, because the infamous whore of Babylon is in fact portrayed by St. John in the guise of Europa, riding on a beast. The central event prophesied in the Apocalypse is the great apostasy, a falling away en masse from the faith of formerly Catholic countries, Europe having been destined to become the heart of Christendom. St. John represents the spiritual adultery of the apostate church in the form of a prostituted Europa. The falling away of Catholic countries into Protestantism was widely regarded by Catholics in the 16th century as the beginning of the Great Apostasy, as Pope Paul IV himself speculated, while Protestants, for their part, accused the Pope of being the Antichrist and the Roman Church of being the whore of Babylon. Nearing the death of Paul IV in 1559, there was even fear among Catholics that this slander might come true should a crypto-Protestant be elected to the papacy and institute the abomination of desolation by installing a Luther table in the sanctuary of every Catholic church. To allay such fear, the ailing Pope Paul IV wrote the papal bull Cum ex apostolatus officio, declaring that no heretic, even if otherwise lawfully elected, can assume the office of the papacy or command the submission of the faithful. Considering that Titian painted the rape of Europa between 1559 and 62, he could hardly have failed to address the apocalyptic anxiety of the times. Titian's Europa sports two colorful draperies of red and gold, not entirely unlike the whore of Babylon, who wears purple and scarlet. Just as Europa's abduction is involuntary, most Catholics who suddenly found themselves in Protestant countries had no desire to separate themselves from the Church, but neither did they have the will to go into exile or suffer persecution for the faith. Hence Titian's Europa holds on to her abductor, grasping the horn of the bull for fear of drowning. This is a particularly fitting image of the tragic fate of English Catholics, who in 1558 had suddenly found themselves once again oppressed by a Protestant government upon the death of Mary Tudor, the wife of Philip II, who commissioned the Poesiae. Even if Titian had given no thought to such matters, which is inconceivable, it wouldn't matter in the least, because what determines the meaning of a painting is not the author's unknowable idiosyncratic intention, but the context which can be known and brought to bear. Very often a painter plays with iconography without any particular intention, but in such a way as to allow it to generate meaning of itself. One finds the same in Dante's poetry, as everything Dante says has 14 different sides to it. He couldn't possibly have intended every implication of his words, but he didn't need to, because the power of a deep tradition is that it generates profundity all by itself. The painter is an avatar of his tradition. He makes art that transcends his own hand, as well as his intentions, because he does not speak a private language, but a language shared in common with others across time and space. Through him, the whole tradition speaks. I trust that the tradition speaks through my works as well. In the descriptions that follow, I recount the stories that my paintings depict, reflect on their allegorical significance, and explain how my interpretation of each story informed the design of my paintings. I also present a source analysis of my paintings, which is essential to understanding any work of art. Originality is always derivative, because no artist creates in a vacuum without reference to other works of art. To quote the art historian Norman Bryson, the meaning of a painting is always another painting. In good Socratic style, academic art is a dialogue in which one artist speaks and another responds. Each work of art is designed, like a work of rhetoric, to make an argument by appeal to reason, authority, and emotion. Hence, academic artists have always eschewed capricious originality, preferring to cite authoritative works of art in an appeal to sound precedent. Whereas the Romantics' inventions appeal only to emotion, and the Enlightenment rationalists' inventions appeal only to reason, the true academician appeals to all three. The academician recognizes the authority not only of nature, but also of the old masters, and he emulates them, not only to give them honor, but also to enter into lively competition with them. Only by appropriating the tradition in this way can an artist hope to stand atop it. Lastly, the descriptions also include some information about technique. My methods are very traditional, though I do not confine myself to an historical palette or eschew modern materials when they have superior qualities. Most of my history paintings, for example, are painted on canvas mounted on aluminum panels. Even though this is a material that the old masters did not use, mounting my canvases on a metal substrate has the advantage of making my paintings more impervious to the ravages of time. Structural problems like cracking, which inevitably plague paintings on stretched canvas, are all but eliminated by using a rigid substrate. To take another example, my palette consists primarily of traditional pigments such as lead white, natural umbers, siennas, and ochres, as well as rarer pigments like Naples yellow, genuine vermilion, and rose madder. But I will avail myself of modern synthetic pigments to extend the traditional palette, including titanium white and cadmium red, as well as a range of blues and greens. I also use modern mediums, such as stand oil, which is superior to the traditional sun-thickened oils that the old masters used.